That sounds good.
Right, we're ready to go, folks?
Yeah.
Hello and good afternoon and welcome to Architecture the Edge, series of talks for the autumn of 2021. Finishing off our series of alternative futures, we're looking at bungalows, and we're joined this afternoon by Adrian Duncan, Emma McKeagney and Hugh Wallace. The talk is going to be moderated by Laurence Lord. Laurence is an architect with AP+E and a lecturer at Queen's University Belfast. AP+E is a design and research studio based in Ireland and the Netherlands. It operates in the space between design, strategy, and architecture to apply fresh perspectives and draw parallels between the wide range of issues concerning the contemporary built environment. The practice is driven by a strong interest in the social and cultural value of architecture. Laurence is part of the Free Market team as co-commissioner curator of the Irish Pavilion at the Venice Biennale 2018, and just recently announced this week as winner of the RIAI Future Award. So congratulations to Laurence on that achievement. I'm actually going to pass over to Laurence now, who's going to introduce our panelists. Thanks everyone to join us today.
Great. Thanks, Frank. Delighted to be here. So welcome all to this afternoon's Architecture at the Edge conversation about Bungalow Bliss. As Frank has outlined, my name is Laurence Lord and I'm an architect with AP+E and a lecturer in Queen's University Belfast. So this afternoon we're delighted to be joined by three speakers. So we've Adrian Duncan, Emma McKegney, Hugh Wallace, who will each present their position and research on the topic, and following that we'll have a discussion about this humble Irish institution, these little republics, to quote one of our guests, where they came from, their position in the pantheon of Irish domestic architecture, their international connections, their legacy, and ultimately what the future holds. Before I introduce the speakers, I'm going to give a little bit of context of today's topic. Bungalow Bliss, as I'm sure all of you know, is a book by Jack Fitzsimons from the early 70s. It was a set of one-off plans that could be conveniently ordered from the author, submitted for planning, costed, and then built. It was a taxonomy of typologies. The book was hugely successful, with many editions over a 30-year span. It effectively became the original catalogue for middle-income rural dwellers to make their own homes. Unfortunately, it was ultimately a victim of its own success. Short-sighted planning laws and the agrarian tradition of living on the land has seen the simple bungalow turn into a symbol for sprawl, the suburbanization of the landscape, conformism, and what some would cite as generic architecture. The bungalow became representative of all the ills of the rural built environment to some aspects of the media. In 1987, the then environmental correspondent for the Irish Times, the inimitable Frank MacDonald, coined the term bungalow blight, referring to bungalows as the structural litter on the landscape, litter that can never be removed. The architectural profession seemed to have made its mind up on these designs. The tide had started to turn on these building of these homes, or had it. This conversation about one-off housing in the rural is still happening at a policy level within the current government. The Green Party, for example, have been very clear in their position that one-off housing has had a significant social and environmental impact that has also contributed to the hollowing out of rural Irish towns. Fine Gael, though, are quoted from last August as saying that they see one-off rural housing still contributing to at least a quarter of all new houses going forward, which can only be viewed as ambitious within a housing crisis. The simple fact is that these buildings exist. They are scattered all across the countryside within our landscape, and as a result of individual property ownership, their status is secure. These houses are going nowhere, and the countryside will not be returning to what it was previously, and nor should it. The domestic Irish architecture vernacular is here to stay. However, it is because of the perceived negative impact and image of the bungalow and the omnipresent nature of these houses that needs to be critically discussed. And these buildings, along with their cultural value, their legacy, and their role. We're delighted to be joined today by a number of speakers and experts on the topic: Adrian Duncan, Emma McKegney, and Hugh Wallace. I'll just give a brief introduction to each of our speakers, who will then be speaking for 7 to 8 minutes, presenting a number of slides. We will then have a more general group discussion on the booklet. So firstly, Adrian Duncan is an artist and award-winning writer based in Ireland and Berlin. His debut novel, Love Notes from a German Building Site, was published by Lilliput Press and Head of Zeus in 2019. It won the 2019 John McGovern Book Prize. In 2020, he was shortlisted for the Dalkey Literary Awards Emerging Writer. Adrian's second novel, A Sabbatical in Leipzig, was published also by Lilliput Press in 2020. His collection of short stories, Midfield Dynamo, was published in 2021 and was longlisted for the Edgehill Prize. And his third novel, The Geometer Lobachevsky, will appear next year. In 2021, he exhibited in collaboration with Fergal Ward, a large-scale film sculpture installation work titled The Soil Became Scandinavian at Visual Carlo. From 1995, Duncan studied and worked as a structural engineer for over a decade in the UK and Ireland before returning to study fine art. He is currently co-editor of the paper Visual Art Journal. I first came across the work of Adrian with his wonderful short film in collaboration with Fergal Ward, Bungalow Bliss from 2016, featuring the music of the late Conor Walsh. Emma McKeagney is an early career artist and researcher who has just completed an MA in Irish Studies at NUI Galway. McKegney's current fixations are the agency of non-human actants, the archaeology of design and political ecologies. In 2018, she exhibited her first solo show, Unstable Categories, in Palace Projects and Studios in Dublin, where she explored the bird categories of human, non-human and design. She has recently been awarded the Agility Award by the Arts Council of Ireland to turn her recent MA dissertation on Irish bungalows into photography and oral history project. And finally, Hugh Wallace is a well-respected, award-winning architect and founding partner of Douglas Wallace Consultants. He was a passion for creative design that engages with his audience to create conversation and comment. He believes that good architecture is essential to create social cohesion and enhance our enjoyment of our landscape and living environment, whether it's the city or countryside. Hugh, as I'm sure you all know, is a judge on Home of the Year. He also presents the Great House Revival. And most relevant, I would argue, to today's conversation is his new series, Bungalow Bliss, coming to RT television very soon. The show will follow 4 bungalow owners as they engage 4 innovative architects who will redesign their homes, making them contemporary and more eco-friendly. So without further ado, I'll pass over to our first speaker today, over to Adrian. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Laurence, for that lovely introduction. And thank you very much, Frank, for inviting me to this event. I'm very happy to be taking part with you and Emma. So yeah, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk a little bit about a book, this book here by Aoife McNamara, which was published in 2006. This was sort of the first serious study that I've come across of the Bungalow Bliss phenomenon. It was a sort of a sustained period of research that was carried out from the late 90s up until 2006. And it produced a number of exhibitions in London, Glasgow, Letterkenny, and Dublin. It involved two photographers, Andrew Carney and Paul Antic. And this catalogue was the kind of end result of all of this work. So it was researched through traditional academic means, but also through making and visual art presentation. In the book, she talks about the relationship of curating a visual art exhibition with the bungalow space in mind. Aoife also carries out interviews with the 2 photographers. But most importantly is an essay she's written in this book called The House That Jack Built, where she takes a very, very serious look at the criticism of the Bungalow Bliss houses back in the late 80s. It's probably one of them, I think it certainly has underpinned a lot of my thinking about that aspect of the Bungalow Bliss houses, where the criticisms came from and why they were framed in the way they were, and what was the cultural imagination of the critics, essentially. So I would like to just present her work because she's not here, but it's a very, very important contribution, I think. My involvement in the Bungalow Bliss thing has been going on for about 12 years or so now. Started as an MA thesis up in the Art and Contemporary World course in NCAD. After that, I continued sort of exhibiting in places like Sirius Art Centre and Askeaton and the Irish Embassy and in Berlin and the Dock. I collaborated with Olga Tiernan, who's a fabric designer, textile print designer, on a work that we're going to be producing another one next year. Then in 2016, as Laurence mentioned, I made a film with Fergal Ward for TG Carr. And it was about the great Irish artworks of the last 100 years, essentially artworks and architecture. And our proposal was that the Bungalow Bliss houses are, whether you like them or not, one of the most important architectural contributions to the Irish state. 2018, I did a project in Galway Arts Centre called the Bungalow Bliss Bus Tour, where I organised with the Redbird Group and Galway Arts Centre a day tour out to Moycullen, down to Spiddle, over to Furbo and Barna, and then back into Galway. And over the course of this loop, we visited a variety of companies like, say, Crook Concrete, Celtic Crystal, Flannery's Joineries, Lines, Carpets. And we visited so we got a kind of a on the spot kind of oral history of these businesses and these families who contributed elements to the Bungalow Bliss buildings. So whether it be blocks, whether it be lintels, whether it be glass, whether it be fenestration or carpets. So that was in 2018. And then this year I've returned again to the subject, and I am producing a book next year with Lilywood Press and an exhibition at the Irish Architectural Archive. So all of this sort of came together then I've started bringing it together this year, and I'm going to read an article that I wrote for the Irish Times in July of this year, which was, I'll share it on the screen actually. This article was to celebrate the 50th anniversary of Bungalow Bliss, not to celebrate, but to mark it. So I'm just going to read from this article, and then I'll pass over and hand over to. So when I was 11 or so, my father left his job in the Longford County Council to set up his own engineering consultancy. He converted one of the bedrooms in our house into a drawing office where he drafted house plans, planning permissions for local people hoping for a home. I was in primary school and enjoyed watching him inking up a design, his hand expertly zipping horizontal lines across the tracing paper, then dropping a variety of careful verticals and diagonals until all of these lines of wet ink began of a single-story house. These houses he drew were quite similar and originated in one way or another from a set of house designs that had by then been around for almost 2 decades, the Bungalow Bliss set of house designs. I went through secondary school, taking mostly technical subjects, and then studied structural engineering in Scotland. During the summer breaks, I came home to help out with my father's growing consultancy. The office was now in what was once our turf shed and consisted of a spacious and bright drafting room with 2 drawing tables, a print room, and a small office. My father's business was by then not only producing many house designs, but also some larger housing schemes, and I helped with mapping, printing, and carrying out some drafting too. Here I saw, now under my own hand, bungalows begin to take more. When I graduated from university, I went off and worked for a number of structural engineering firms in the UK and Ireland, designing multi-story commercial buildings, and I forgot about the bungalows. A decade later, I had a job. I'd left my job as an engineer and enrolled in the National College of Art and Design for an MA called The Contemporary World. I took a course called Other Modernisms, and each week our lecturers presented us with a variety of works of art and architecture from around the world. It was in this class, gazing at colourful slides of curved and pointed edifices, the work of Oscar Niemeyer in Brasilia, Belo Horizonte, Niterói, and being told how these designs were a blend of high modern and local architectural styles, that I first wondered, what might the Irish other modernism be? The Bungalow Bliss that lay around my father's office rushed back to mind. I realized these books had influenced not just his drawings, but also the drawings of countless engineers and draftspersons throughout the country at the time. I resolved to explore from where these influential books had come. One morning, half a century ago, in 1971, a man called Jack Fitzsimons left his house in Kells, County Meath, with a car boot full of small, self-published books. He drove around the twisting trunk roads of rural Ireland to large towns in the Midlands, South and West, selling these books to any newsagents, petrol stations, and bookshops that would take them. Declared across the front cover of these books were the words Bungalow Bliss. They contained 20 house designs that could be used to build affordable homes. The designs were ordered from Fitzsimons over the phone. The drawings were sent for a small fee and put through the planning process and built. Before this book appeared, the options for housing in rural Ireland were inheritance, getting on the housing list, or emigrating. Bungalow Bliss became an instant bestseller. Soon edition 2 appeared, and edition 3, 4. The book was rewritten, expanded on, and republished up through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. A 12th edition was released in 98 and reprinted in 2001. During these 30 years, over 250,000 copies were sold, roughly 1 for every second household in the countryside. By the late 70s, around the time I was born, over 10,000 one-off bungalows were being built in rural Ireland. The cost of land was low to the cost of construction. And the plan area of each design in the book fell under 125 square meters that qualified a homeowner for state aid of just over £300. Affordable cars and motorbikes had become the dominant mode of transport in the countryside, and the homes that this newly mobilized generation was building were sited along the sides of public roads, often on the outskirts of small and larger towns, where property and space were less expensive, and where there was more potential to expand the home to suit an enlarging family. This all led to ribbons of these houses, most of which were in plots of land, tiny republics, as John McGarner called them, all between 1/2 and 3/4 of an acre, a dimensional stem capital gains tax break of which farmers could then avail. Appearing also on the rural landscape were regional technical colleges and ideas, all modular things hosting a kind of education. The form of building in rural Ireland was changing greatly. I remember while I was researching all of this in NCAD, I looked again at the planning permission documents required for a one-off house. By the stark fragment of this document, it consisted of a soil test, a series of site maps of increasing scale, and 6 copies of the house plans being proposed for the site. The Ordnance Survey land maps used in this planning pack had no contours on them, so the only sense of 3-dimensional interplay for any proposed site was 2 numerical spot levels indicating the difference in height between the main road and the floor of the new house. The site was. The schematic nature of this planning suited not only the technical skill set of those applying for planning, but also those judging it in the county councils, where at the time no architects were employed. This form of mapping effectively flattened the country, and when the countryside merely undulated, this planning document functioned well, but when the land began to roll and lift, especially in the west, this system broke down disastrously, to the point, as some said then, of desecration. By the late 1980s, these planning issues, including Mr. Section 4 of the Planning Act, petitions to overturn planning decisions, sparked outrage from the architectural establishment and segments of the broadsheet press, much of which centred on how these new houses were harmful to the environment and inauthentic to the land. The vernacular cottage was held up often in a kind of Gaelic revivalist manner as an exemplar of how one-off housing in the Irish countryside should appear. The form and look of a thatched cottage stems from the materials available to build it: stone, timber, straw. The basic building blocks of a Bungalow Bliss home are all precast concrete and 440 millimeters in length. This dimension dictated the size of the windows, which were cast lintels, the lengths of which were all a multiple of this 440 millimeter long block. Expensive concrete products could be bought off the shelf at any of the concrete works that then dotted the country, usually near a limestone quarry. One of the new planning rules for houses, the house design at this time, was that the window openings to each room had to be no less than 1/10 of the floor area they served. So if you combine the height of the previous cottage windows, the need for a larger window opening, the precast lintels available, and the type of to-hand building skills in place, you end up with the typical large window of the Bungalow Bliss house. This blend of precedent, available materials, and available skills extends to every other aspect of these houses: the plinth, the walls, the roof, the chimney, and it produced a new and vast vernacular. One afternoon last month, while I was visiting parents, I took a walk around the house, looking at the many extensions added to it over the years, trying to call the people who had to build them. That evening, I asked my father which of his friends had helped him build the original bungalow. He told me with a rueful laugh about the time he and his friends missed the second half of the 1976 FA Cup final because the cement supplier employed to pour the foundations of our house, a GAA man apparently, turned up at the site just before half-time. My father and his friends received a call on the pub and hastened back to site to begin the pour. While my father recounted this, I thought of him and his friends as young, laying the foundations of our house, then building up the walls, erecting the prefabricated roof trusses, fitting the tiles, the chimney pots and capping stones, then sealing it all with standard windows, doors, and swathes of plaster and paint. It occurred to me that this generation of homeowners was carrying out across the countryside a traditional mehel, albeit one happening within a strange new matrix of progress and standardization. It then occurred to me that this generation of people was building in a way wholly authentic to the time, and that they produced homes that accurately reflected the economic, administrative, and technological developments fluxing around them. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Adrian. Emma, if I could pass over to you now, that'd be great.
Thanks very much for that, Adrian. And thank you, Frank, for having me. And I'm very grateful to be speaking here today alongside Adrian and Hugh. And thank you, Laurence, as well, for hosting it today. I'm going to be sharing my screen, and I'm reading from a script because otherwise I would just be blabbing away for a long time. Now, can you see that all?
Yep.
Yeah. So in a 2016 publication by Beatriz Colomina and Mark Wigley entitled "Are We Human? Notes on an Archaeology of Design," a book which I continue to return to, they speak about the malleability of the human, in that what makes us human is not our brain or our body or our thought, but more our interdependency with artifacts. They say the human is suspended in a complex and continuous back and forth between itself and artifacts, a flickering that ultimately dissolves the distinction between them. Designed artifacts have as much agency as the animals seemingly producing them. Nowhere is this statement more true when it comes to forms of housing. When we decide to build a home on the landscape, whether it be within a village or a city network, in a housing estate, a block of apartments, or the seemingly untethered bungalow, we are redesigning ourselves, and those spaces will go on to redesign us again and again with small modifications along the way. What I became fascinated with at first when researching the bungalow is the malleability of this term, bungalow. You'll see from these images its evolution from the middle of the 1800s up to the early 1900s, from something that would have only been seen as an Indian term and something that became omnipresent in Europe and afar. In the 19th century, this term had ties to colonial India, coming from Bungalow, the term for a thatched native hut in the Bengal region, yet it slowly merged its way into becoming one of the most common dwelling types across the world. From my fascinations, I prefer to ask, how has the bungalow formed us, rather than how did we form the bungalow? The bungalow, more than just being one story, encapsulates a moment in societies where building a home could be controlled by the individual, family, or landowner. It signifies a break away from what is vernacular towards a capitalist hegemony, while still taking on local networks of collective building, or the ancient collectivist approach in rural Ireland, Mehel. Across England, the US, and eventually Ireland, the bungalow swept and brought about a do-it-yourself, roll-up-your-sleeves attitude to securing a home, more akin to pre-industrial home building. Planners in England coined the term ribbon development in the early 1930s and cracked down on the dichotomies of town and country. In Ireland, our embedded cultural attachment to the land, mostly down to the land wars of the late 19th century, meant this dichotomy was always leaky, and we allowed for and even encouraged the spread into the countryside. Many cultural commentators, and probably many people here today, will call this a planning failure. But one point which I would like to drive home is one made by Anthony D. King in his book on the bungalow, that the act of curtailing the supply of land for self-building through rigorous town and country planning laws creates a kind of artificial land shortage. And this land keeps people out of quality housing they could theoretically build themselves if they had the chance. This dichotomy we create between urban and rural is as much about housing as it is about control over housing. And the person who can choose a rural plot for a bungalow is also choosing control over their living standards, which is not always possible within highly erratic urban housing markets. If you're renting at the moment in any town centre in Ireland today, you will more than understand this reality. These strict spatial dynamics in England caused high amounts of urban tensions and reiterates class dynamics with each. In the urban skyscraper, for instance, social structures are decided by the architecture of apartments on top of one another, with the richer higher to the sky and the poorer below. Conversely, quote, everyone is on a level with the bungalow. You're either above or below in the towering city dwelling, end quote, from King. This equalizing force of the bungalow was recognized by Jack Fitzsimons in Bungalow Bliss, and its proliferation in the country complicates distinctions of class. With the freedom to build a bungalow on cheap land far away from rigid city structures and planning, the class element of access to space is somehow complicated. One generation can literally move from one kind of class spatial structure to the untethered bungalow. From my study of the bungalow and the cultural backlash it received, I began to see a glaring rift within the dynamics of design, and like this rift. Michael Scott's Gera, built in 1937, and Paul Henry's Sunny Day in Connemara, painted in 1940. The early Irish Free State's relationship with design and architecture evolved along perpendicular lines of promoting new and elegant modernisms in town and city centres, and maintaining an image of the rural Irish idyll. This idyll was expected to remain crystallized in the past, and the dwellers of these cottages were expected to remain in these dark, damp, unhealthy spaces of dual design standards, which arguably led to the pattern book bungalow craze in rural Ireland to design within Swedish socialist democracy, and how they used a quality for all approach to promote class cooperation. The Folkhemmet, the people's home, was the metaphor for their welfare state, and it made sure to provide every citizen with equal access to the basic tenets of a good home life, using design and equal access to quality materials as its backbone. Interestingly, I think Jack Fitzsimon's aims were similar. When you read the texts within Bungalow Bliss editions, you can see his main aim is to allow access to design to a wider range of people it was available to prior to his book. Clearly, there is something in the air, seeing as this event is happening today, but it's now time to reframe what the bungalow did for Ireland. Yes, they were not perfect. I agree with the issues about which urban development bring for environmental futures and strains on services and ensuring further reliance on cars. Yet I think there is so much more to the moment which brought real houses to real people out of a self-published book. I plan, funded by the Arts Council, to travel and photo what the bungalow has done for their life. It's time to let the bungalow and its inhabitants speak. There's so much to learn from what can only be described as this mass movement of bungalow bliss. In a moment where we are grappling to house ourselves safely, sustainably, equally, and cheaply, the bungalow may form part of an answer. Yet a dual approach to housing and design led us to the bungalow, and I think a new iteration is one within a unified housing approach, something closer to the Swedish Folkhemmet. How can we build a housing system for all which is more like a bungalow, untiered, one story, new and collective? And that's me. If you want to follow along, I'm on Instagram at Bungalows of Ireland as well, and thanks a million for letting me speak today.
Great, thank you, Emma. And finally, Hugh, if I could pass over to you, please.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me here today. I think that Adrian and Emma have spoken very interestingly about the bungalow. And my fascination with the bungalow would have been from my family's side on my mum and dad, where my uncles and aunts would have abandoned their farmhouse and built the bungalow beside it, one even letting the cattle come in and use it. And there was a disrespect, we would say today, for the housing stock in Ireland. But it wasn't disrespect. People lived in dire conditions in our towns, cities, and in our countryside. 40% of rural Ireland, towns and villages and countryside, had no indoor toilet in 1960s, in the late 1960s. And the towns and villages were equally past their sell-by date in terms of living standards. And the bungalow was the Beetle, the people's car. It was a solution for those forgotten by government who were off building council estates and houses, and inspiration of Donamead or in Cork, those council houses that we all envy to love today, built in concrete, 2 down, 3 up. But even in those houses, the toilet was out the back for fear the smell could asphyxiate you. So, for me, the 1970s architectural profession had neglected the countryside and did not provide solutions, and Jack arrived with his little book. It was a godsend. It was a godsend to the Irish people. And we talk about ribbon developments, but in fact, the ribbon development was more the people in the towns and villages building their bungalows immediately outside their town because they were living in damp, dreary, horrible conditions. 2 rooms, 3 rooms, with families of 6 and 7. And this little book arrived. And we also have to understand that the Land Commission at the time were doling out 50 acres farms all across our countryside. And 50 acres was not actually a sustainable farm. So you're actually moving people from the west of Ireland to the Midlands of Ireland in poverty, to remain in poverty. And thankfully, they had road frontage. Because that road frontage allowed their children to go to college, because the farm wasn't going to allow them to go to college. And I think you have to put the bungalow in that context. And, you know, the bungalow came out of a series of events. The government said, oh, we'll provide grants because they were going to build houses in the countryside. So the bungalow got defined as an internal floor area of 1,200 square feet. Now, funnily enough, today that's a perfect size because our families are smaller. And a lot of these homes were self-built. And off you'd go and you'd do your 6-week course on how to lay foundations, then you do your 6-week course on how to do concrete. You get your friend or your cousin who is an electrician to wire it up. And if you were lucky enough, you put in a boiler. Otherwise, it was the good old fire with the back boiler in it, with the hot press right beside it. And you could run 3 radiators out of it and bring in your super stair and let the condensation run down the windows. But what amazed me going into the architectural archive is the drawings from Jack are there. So house plan 1 is there, and there are 3 drawings, that's all. 3 tracing drawings, and all the information you needed to build the building, your bungalow, were on 3 drawings. You got local materials, you got local timber, you got everything came locally. And you probably put up the blocks yourself. But the great thing in those days is you had local building inspectors who would come around and assist you and say, you're not doing that right, do this, there's lintels. So in a funny way, it was a better off period to build your own home because there was somebody from the government and from the local council to assist you. You know, there's about 400,000 individual homes in Ireland, and the bungalow actually forms the great majority. And I look back at this, and I just wonder, why did architects not get involved? It was like they were slightly elitist, and a bungalow was below them. The councils then produced their version of pattern book bungalows, which were ye old traditional, with our gable end roofs coming up, small windows with sash windows and tiled true tone slate roofs. And weren't the solution, but was something to mitigate against what was seen as a blight on our countryside. Roadstone produced another book 12 architects produced architectural homes with mono pitches, flat roofs. And the folk in the countryside said, what are you doing? Anyway, they cost twice the price to build. So the bungalow for me is the last vernacular architectural style that's immediately visible, and it's everywhere in our country. And I believe the bungalow has a huge role to play in the future of the country in its rehabilitation, because basically it's a rectangular building with 4 walls. You can strip out the inside. A lot of the time you can leave the roof in place and off you go and reinvent the inside. You can obviously insulate it, bring it up to standard, but reinvent it so that you can actually create a bungalow in an interior home that follows the sun, because as we all know, the front window just follows the front wall. The other thing that I remember about bungalows, because I would have been in my early 20s at the time, and Basta Locks is a company in Ireland, and you only got the grant if you bought Irish. But Basta Locks were just rubbish. So the builders would bring in the Basta Locks, fix them to all the doors, the inspector would come around, do the inspection, then all the Basta Locks would be taken off and moved to the next bungalow, and then the actual locks you wanted to put in were put in. So there's a phenomenon with the bungalow, and I just think in the future they can be upcycled and recycled and made very special. But I also believe that our vision of public transport is going to just change. The only reason you can't tell the car to drive itself is for insurance reasons. So at the moment in Zurich or Geneva, they can't decide who gets sued if there's a car accident. Is it the software? Is it the hardware? Is it the car? Is it the drive? And that's all that's stopping us having cars that drive themselves. So in the future, I just see you'll have electric cars, you go on your app and you say, I'd like to collect and go somewhere, car will arrive, collect 4 of you, and off you go. So I just think we need to reimagine our country. And I think, again, I just think, I genuinely believe there's huge opportunity to reinvent and rehabilitate our bungalows. And, you know, the TV show that I'm involved with, which go out on the 1st of December, I've seen 2 of the finished bungalows, and they're like chalk and cheese. You can't visualize when you see the final bungalow as to what it was. And I think that to me is inspirational. And I'm looking forward to seeing the inspiration around our countryside as these bungalows get refurbished and reimagined. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Hugh. Thank you all. Okay, so I'm gonna sort of start a question, and maybe I'll aim this one at Emma initially, and then Adrian afterwards. You both advocated for and spoke quite passionately about the importance societally and historically about these buildings. Sort of the idea of their cultural legacy, the memory, the lives that have passed in these buildings. I would suggest that a lot of architects are notoriously poor at this. We like to cover these things up, give them a new lick of paint, make buildings radically different, and anything is sort of its tokenism or its facadism, box ticking. But Emma, if you could you explain why the history of the building or the memory of the building and why that's important, please?
Well, I think what Hugh has been saying is, you know, it's very important to know, you know, improving them and bringing them into the present day is really important. But I think they haven't been given their time to be appreciated in their aesthetics of the 70s, in the historical moment they were part of at that time. And you know, when I started going into it, I also didn't realize the global significance of the bungalow and its, you know, long history. And, you know, I think the first pattern book in England came out in 1891, you know, so there's this whole, the pattern book by Jack Fitzsimons wasn't in a vacuum either. So, you know, to actually consider them in their time, in their moment, is, if we don't do it now, it's going to be a missed opportunity, because they all will be modernized eventually, or, you know, taken away or whatever. So I think it's high time they actually get their time in the limelight.
Let's unpack that a little. So there's you're advocating for a preservation on some aspect of this?
Not even preservation, just recording, you know, like the time that's in it, and even just the scale of it is huge. And I think if you're Irish and you're, you know, in any way familiar with the landscape, you know them, but I've been amazed at when I start explaining to people about them, they don't really know. And then when you kind of show them pictures, they're like, oh yeah, those things, they're just everywhere. But, you know, they have flown under the radar and they are misunderstood. And I think even just like the global significance is kind of downplayed as well. It's been seen as an Irish problem rather than something that's happened everywhere as well. Like, I was amazed with the links or the similarities between what was happening in 1930s England and the conversations around the bungalow then were almost identical to the conversations we were having in the 80s and 90s.
Okay, and Adrian, if I can turn to you as well, you've written very eloquently on this subject in the past regarding how the building appears, its frontality, the proportion of the windows, the scale of the roof, all of these critical aspects, and then when you talk about the stark pragmatism or the simplicity in construction, are very much connected to a vernacular or a critical regionalism of that time. Can you speak to me why this is important?
Yeah, well, I think what's really my issue is trying to understand what they actually are, you know, and I think part of it is to try and understand is to like imagine them through their building materials, and to sort of try and make sense of them through the building materials. And I think what's also really important in trying to understand why they look like that, why are they like this, you know, is to look at the cultural underpinnings and the administrative underpinnings. So what was changing in Ireland before the 70s? What sort of education was available to people in the 70s and 80s? Where was their design education coming from? Why were these things so popular? So that's really what my interest is in, and also looking at them through the elements, like through the actual objects, the separate sills and the separate blocks and and the prefabricated trusses. And I think what's interesting is that it marks a sort of shift from craft to skill in assemblage in Irish society and in rural society, because the bungalows really are assemblages of individual modular units. And this goes right the way through the bungalow. There's very, very little evidence of craft. That's why, you know, improvisations like, say, architectural improvisations, say a floor to ceiling window or something like that, that would require a non-standard solution. So that's why these sort of things didn't happen. So the bungalows will tell us much about the people, but also you have to understand, it's kind of a two-way street. You have to understand something about the society to understand the bungalows as well. So going over and back between the object and the sort of forces holding them are that's how I navigate the subject. Yeah,
I think that's really interesting. That they're a product of their time. In a way, they couldn't be any other way, is what the suggestion is by implication.
Yeah, well, I think Fitzsimons' designs obviously had a huge effect, but they were made within, he had a very, very deep knowledge of building himself, to hand building. He worked on the rural electrification scheme when he was younger, and he understood the wiring of houses and how houses worked. And when you look at the actual basic size, as Hugh was pointing out earlier, they are very pragmatic, but they do work. And they produced, for the first time in Irish, in great numbers, zoned living space. There's a really lovely piece in edition 1 where Jack describes that a bedroom is not only just for sleeping in, but for dressing in also. He also talks about there's an extraordinary list of electrical appliances that can be used in a house, and there's a lovely humane detail where he says, if the house is for elderly people, don't put the plugs too low. He was a very, very humane designer. He thought very, very deeply about these things. But I think the aesthetic obviously owes a lot to what he came up with. And it's, I mean, what he came up with points to the previous vernacular as well in certain ways. It's not completely miles away from it. It does point to it in certain ways. The roof pitch, the fact that the chimney is 2 feet above the ridge. These are things that come from the ridge barge ends. The way in which the big gable finishes uprightly. These are things that come from the vernacular. So it was like an imaginative, like a reimagining of the vernacular that he did, and then coupled with these modular materials, they developed into what they are.
Great, thanks, Adrian. And Hugh, if I can come to you on that then, just slightly more taking that question, but focusing on the future. So if these buildings in a way reimagine the vernacular, and then the building, according to the building standards and how we bring these buildings up to code effectively, and then very little is left of the original building. How does that sit then conceptually as for you as an architect? If it's if that cultural memory is kind of glossed over or wiped away.
Well, I don't think you'll ever wipe away the memory, because there are so many bungalows around the country. So I don't think 300,000 bungalows will all of a sudden disappear. And I do think the point about memories is very important. And, again, people who are in the bungalow today, who are modernizing, it's very fun. They talk about the family and who lived there and their memories. And the fact that they're all excited that they're now going to live in a bungalow and have their memories with their family as they grow older. Emma said an Irish problem, but I don't believe the bungalow was an Irish problem. I think it was the journalists and architects decided to make the bungalow an Irish problem. The bungalow was as a result of living conditions which you would not understand today, and yet it's only 50 years ago. And the conditions people lived in was appalling. And I can remember that, because I remember going to my aunt's house with 4 rooms. And, I just think that the bungalow came out of form follows function, and Jack understood that to perfection. To get right down to the point, Jack also provided the cost of building the bungalow. So to build a bungalow was 13,000 punts at the time. And I think taking Adrian's point of the bungalow to a certain extent, just like the cottage, came out of the ground, because the concrete was made locally, the blocks were made locally, and the windows were made locally. So there was still that sense of local involvement in the building of these bungalows. Today, we've all moved on, and that's because of regulation, that would be an impossibility. And, the bungalow was of our time, but the great thing about it is the basis of the bungalow can be the basis for the new home or new house, and the way we live today, and the materials we need, and the ratings we need to get in terms of A's and B's, and they can be transformed. And so, I think the bungalow is just a magical structure that we can, if we can grab, we can partially resolve some of the housing crisis in the country. And, I think it's very exciting. And I do think the bungalow is maligned. And I do think that the patterns of the way we lived in Ireland, so when you're up in Inchone, there's a plethora of bungalows, which everybody bemoans the fact. But in fact, those bungalows just replaced a 2-roomed cottage. But the actual pattern of housing and where it was hasn't actually changed that much.
Well, if I can just sort of zoom in on one aspect there, Hugh, you mentioned that with current regulation, that returning to this is an impossibility. And both Emma and Adrian cited this methyl aspect. I think I'm going to be rereading that final paragraph again of that article that Adrian read out in terms of the wholly appropriate material selection and then building their own house at this particular time. Is that past? Is there a potential that the self-build is potentially the future? Because we know that in current economies in the Netherlands, in parts of the UK as well, that local councils have opened up these avenues for these service sites and people can come in and build upon them. Is there a version of events where there's a sustainable model where people can self-build their own homes? And maybe I'll go to Hugh on that first.
I think today it is so much more complicated and complex. And materials are more complex. And what, in terms of insulation and the level of regulation, of health and safety, of compliance, of everything. And if you like, you can no longer rely on the council, the man in the council, to give you guidance and information, because he's long gone. And you're relying on consultants to deliver services. And, I because I'm involved in quite a number, I'm involved in 2 self-builds at the moment. And both of them have been protracted and long and complicated for the homeowners who didn't have a background in building. And I think there is an issue going forward in self-builds, that there will be people who will do that, but I think it's exceptionally complicated today.
Emma, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that in terms of, based on what you're speaking about in terms of the Swedish Filkamet, is there a version of that works in an Irish context? Not that I'm a big believer in wholesaling, transporting cultural ideologies from another society and imposing them on us, but is there a version there, do you think?
Yeah, well, there's one thing I keep rewatching over and over again is, I think it's like 1999 episode of Grand Designs. It's one of Kevin MacLeod's first episodes, where it's a cooperative social housing project. And I think in Ireland today, as a young person, seeing something like that, it's so positive and it's so kind of different to the dynamic or the dialogue around housing today, where it just feels extremely hopeless, extremely like we're never going to be able to enter into anything at all. Whereas something along the lines of cooperative building or self-building, where you can see a real possibility. And Dominic Stevens, his own house in Leitrim, where he's shared all of the methods and all of the drawings online, these kind of things, we really need to have more of a conversation about. And I think building and the whole profession of housing has just become extremely dense and hard to even begin to understand. I'm not coming from any architecture background other than my mum's an architect, but like you just wouldn't even know where to begin. So I think there needs to be some kind of movement where, young people can take it in their own hands, because at the moment it's just hopeless.
And Adrian,
just to make so at the moment, sorry to put in, but so at the moment, one of our projects, we need to get to a B2, and it was at B3. And to get from a B3 to a B2, we had to put water restrictors on the showers. And I think that if I'm getting down to having to put a water restrictor on, we've lost the plot. And that's why it's so complicated to build in Ireland.
There's more specialisms, there's more consultants, there's more people involved in the design team, as opposed to the 3 drawings originally required.
So the SES, the grant system is bizarre. So if you read what the grant system says, it's saying really you need to be spending 100,000 because the cost of the consultants is so high. So I just think, you know, there's a much bigger conversation, particularly if we're to rehabilitate bungalows.
And so, Adrian, if I can turn to you, by the way, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat for any of our panelists. Adrian, if I can turn to you on the future of these buildings, in a lot of cases, they're now situated in mature gardens. They're more nestled into their contexts. That heroic, broad-shouldered facade to the front has kind of been softened by landscaping, and also been compared to the Mac mansions that are appearing in the fields near them. They're quite humble and quite, I guess, in some contexts, noble. Do you have any comment on what you perceive the future of these houses, or as we've talked in the past about these building stock, can potentially be?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things. I think that I think they'll definitely provide a solution. I was just looking at the CSO register, or in the statistics office. They have a map from 2016 showing migration from Dublin. And the largest migration from Dublin at the moment, or in the last, up to 2016, is into the neighbouring counties, which is, you know, Louth, Meath, Kildare, Wicklow. So seems to be a migration of people out into that landscape, into a new suburbia of Dublin. And I think the Bungalow Bliss houses are being taken up and are being used to house a lot of these migrating people. And it's becoming a new suburbia for Dublin, these rural places outside of Dublin County. And I think that the bungalow, a lot of them, when I was doing this research, a lot of them were, as Hugh mentioned, the energy ratings are way down at like D3 and even low Cs. And you have to get these up to a certain level to make them habitable. And if you want to sell them, you have to get them to a certain amount. Now, there are grants available in this kind of stuff. And some of the actual refitting installation work could be done by yourself, you know, if you're physically able. But then there is some of it that if you want to get up to the very higher registers of the energy rating, it requires specialists to fit it. So there's going to be a ceiling in terms of how much you can improve the house, you know. But I think because the houses were designed for not just large families, because it was a modernism with lots of traditional aspects in it. There were large Catholic families in a lot of the houses. And the ability to extend the house because of these modular materials was such that if you did have another child, you could extend the house and put another bedroom into it. And I think what's interesting about the size of the bungalows now is that families aren't that big anymore. You're not getting 5 and 6 children families as often in Ireland. And I think that the bungalows will suit contemporary living, particularly if office space is required and things like this are going to be required in future living situations. So I think the bungalow size, as Hugh mentioned as well earlier, it works very, very well for and I'm talking about like this would be a middle class solution, really, you know, because they are expensive. It's an expensive thing to buy, but it is possible to do it. Whereas the same people trying to buy a house and bring up a family in Dublin, that is becoming almost impossible in terms of just you're priced out of it. So I think there is, in terms of the bungalow, I think there's certainly a very interesting future. I remember when I started my research back 10 years ago, I really didn't know which way it was going to go with the bungalows. I thought they would just fall out of use when the generation who brought them into being fell out of existence, essentially. But no, they seem to be being taken up and they're taken on by people. What I found very interesting was during your course that you did down at UCC with where you had students reimagining the housing stock. I found very interesting that the generational difference between these students and me, these were architectural students who just looked at these as not bungalows with a really problematic visual cultural history, but actually housing stock with opportunity and problems. And I found that coolness and when I say cool, I mean in a good way, the coolness of the gate is very, very interesting and very, very useful to that generation of architects coming through. So yeah, I think they were relatively well constructed up to a certain, you know, era, and really it's insulation and things like that. But as Hugh has alluded to, those are the things that are there's a huge opportunity in them. Yeah.
Thank you, Adrian. There are two questions in the chat, or comments. It's that classic, is it a question, is a comment, that I'm going to put to the panel. The first one is from Mark Ruddy. So Mark has a query regarding the use of the words untethered, not made in a vacuum, pragmatic, product, etc. Standardized land commissioned houses from as early as the 1930s predated the 70s present one-off houses. Many of these lay vacant in the Irish landscape, even though from a social and pragmatic perspective, their positioning in terms of grouping for services, roads, was far more organized and structured, resulting in a more successful vernacular, which responded to the landscape, climate, and social condition. So Bungalow Bliss, as stated by Emma, was not in a vacuum, but was a consecutive phase in rural Ireland post-Land Commission supports ending in the 1960s. Bungalow Bliss should be studied in this context in order to understand our present housing position. So I guess, Emma, if I put that to you, was there learnings from the housing stock that predated Bungalow Bliss to what we're trying to achieve now in terms of Bungalow Bliss as part of our housing stock?
Yeah, absolutely. Like I think it's along this historical pathway that goes back to the land wars, which I stated. So in my dissertation, I go back as far as the formation of the state and the different housing policies they had in place. And the earliest instance of mention of the bungalow in the Dáil was as early as 1924. You know, they were like someone was talking about how there's too many houses that are looking the same cropping up. So Jack Fitzsimons was also basing a lot of the aesthetics on the Land Commission houses, and then also, yeah, these supports and being dropped around the 60s, and the neoliberal turn in government as well is all part of the reason why it was so successful. But yeah, it's all really linked up. What I found fascinating looking at was going back even further into the 1800s and the way bungalow as a term linguistically just merged from something. So I went through newspaper articles where bungalow was mentioned from as early as 1840, and just seeing it slowly merge into, you know, how it was an elite house at some point that the elite would build, who were, you know, colonels or people returning from India, and they'd call their house a bungalow just because it was based on this Indian colonial term. And then when it slowly proliferated, and then up to the 80s and 90s becoming completely disregarded and seen as something, you know, that the elite were throwing out. So that's what I'm fascinated in. But yeah, it's definitely linked to this slow merging from the land war plots and the Land Commission and all of that as well. It's fascinating.
Thanks, Emma. So there's a few questions that have come in that I would, as I'm quickly editorializing here, I would suggest are all of a similar theme. And I think it's something that's incredibly important that we speak about in terms of cutting carbon from travel. There's a suggestion that the nature of how we're living, you know, we're doing this online, for example. I know Adrian's in Berlin. Hugh, I'm guessing you're speaking from Dublin. Emma, are you Dublin as well? I'm not entirely sure. Anyway, I'm from
Sligo.
Sligo. I'm calling in from Cavan. So there's three questions which I'm going to connect here. There's one from Dara Rogan, suggesting that reasoning the built bungalow stock the right direction for modern families, bearing in mind the need to decarbonize transport. Angela Rolfe has a similar suggestion in terms of why would you invest a major retrofit of a late 20th century bungalow in a rural location as opposed to a town or home in, a house in a town or village, supporting the provision of public services and cutting down carbon. And then there was another suggestion in terms of, if we consider this townscape again, there's a from Anne Tynan, there's a difficulty with services. Even rural towns are losing their banks, their post offices. I can testify to that. I live in a rural town in Cavan, and we've recently lost our bank. So in that respect, our one-off houses becoming further and further from shops as everything sadly becomes more centralized. And Hugh, perhaps I can come to you on that. In terms of how we balance this with our carbon futures and sustainable industry and sustainable building, is there something that is of value in terms of this redeveloping or reimagining, as you stated, these bungalows?
Well, there are two points to the question. The first is that the people who live in our towns and villages moved out to the bungalows. and our towns and villages are deserted. And there's a different conversation as to how people move back into the towns and villages. So if you like, that's another day. But to me, that's critically important as part of the regeneration of rural Ireland. Because if you have a sustainable town and village, and all of a sudden you have your bungalows, you know, a mile or half mile or 2 miles out and around as they in ribbon patterns. As I said to you, in my opinion, in 10 years' time, you'll just go on a nap. Nobody will own a car in 20 years' time. None of us. Because why would you own something that you get into for a journey from A to B? Because all you do is go on a nap, the electric car will collect you, and it'll have organised to collect 1 or 2 other people on the journey. So I don't see the issue of living in rural Ireland as a problem going forward, because I think the solution to transport will be very different. I also believe we don't need to travel as much, and therefore our homes, we can work from our homes. You know, I just think there's another dynamic in, like, the groceries will arrive. You know, so I just think they are sustainable, but they're only sustainable if our towns and villages are functioning. And if you like, I think that's a huge conversation, and it's critical to rural Ireland, and it's not being addressed.
And then,
If I could jump in as well, I think one thing that I'm really coming around to is just even taking on some of the spirit of what Bungalow Bliss did, and the ambition of it was to go from a book that was self-published, that taught people how to design their own living, how to deal with the state, how to get the grants, that, you know, I'd love to see that in a booklet, how to, you know, stand up to your landlord in the middle of a housing crisis in Dublin City, you know, this teaching for a younger generation to how to change their situation. And it could be something for a city or a town, but just handing over the tools to lay people who aren't designers, who aren't architects, who are just young people, or, you know, young people trying to raise a family, trying to get into housing and secure housing. And what do we need to fight for? What do we need to ask the government for? Is people like Rory Hearn is an excellent commentator at the moment about the housing crisis, has just put out a book, Housing Shock, and he's just completely outlined why we are in the state we are in. And I think these are the things that I've really got inspiration from with looking back at that moment of Bungalow Bliss, and, you know, the aims he had, which I think we can take inspiration from now.
okay. Well, we're a little bit over. I apologize for everyone on sporting behemoth of a Saturday. I'd like to thank all of our panelists today. Thank you very much, Emma McKeagney, Adrian Duncan, and Hugh Wallace. And very much thanks to Architecture for putting on these events. And I'll see you all very, very soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laurence.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Frank.
You're welcome, Emma. Thanks very much for your contribution. And Hugh.
Thank you very much.
Excellent discussion. Thanks so much.
Not I enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we'll be in touch. Thanks. And thank you, Laurence, for doing a great job there, moderating.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Full disclosure, this call's coming from a bungalow that I'm currently.
Hey!
Yeah.
Great. See you all.